Okay, so in these last few lectures, I want to talk about Mill's utilitarianism. And I talk about Mill for a couple reasons. One, he's one of the sort of founding fathers of utilitarianism. He wrote this in the 1860s, way before these guys like McCaskill and Beckstead, Singer and Bostrom came on the scene. But I also think if you think that effective altruism takes utilitarianism in weird directions, as I tend to, then Mill might be a way to avoid this. I think Mill ultimately gives us possibly a more plausible version of what utilitarian reasoning should look like. So we're going to see how Mill deals with some general objections to utilitarianism and also maybe some problems that pop up specifically when we think about Bostrom, Beckstead, and McCaskill and that style of utilitarianism. I'm ultimately going to say that I think Mill still has some problems, this utilitarianism and bad faith objection. I think Mill takes some of the force out of it, but I still think there's something there. So the first thing to notice about Mill is Mill just admits that it's much harder to know the effects of our actions than do effective altruists. This is a look, Mill does not think that you can assign these neat probabilities to most actions. So, this idea of morality, the effective altruists want to turn morality into almost mathematical science, right? Mill thinks even with utilitarianism, that's not possible, right? He just is dubious that we have this perfect knowledge, which I think is probably right. And Mill goes a step further. Mill says, well, look, it is honestly self-defeating and exhausting to try to constantly do utility calculations. In some cases, they're obviously counterproductive, right? If a bus is bearing down on some poor kid in the street, you don't have time to stand there and be like, well, is he the next Hitler? Probably not. He's probably an ordinary boy. Some chance he's the next Hitler, but some chance he's like the next Jonas Salk. Okay, I should save him. By this point, the bus will have run him over, right? As Mill says, in many cases, there's just not time to do utility calculations. But even when there are, this constant effort would be exhausting. And it would also be self-defeating, right? Mill would argue that constantly trying to do utility calculations is not, in fact, going to create the most happiness. To go back to Sam Bankman-Fried, there's some argument, is he a consistent utilitarian or is he just a crook? I mean, he obviously is a crook, he's been convicted, but is he just a crook or is he a consistent utilitarian as well as a crook, right? I don't know. Michael Lewis, who wrote like this book that's kind of a biography of him, thinks he's a consistent utilitarian and a crook. Consistent utilitarian who just happened to have some bad luck and become a crook. I don't know, but if you read the book, Michael Lewis, not Williams. But one of the things that becomes very clear about Bankman-Fried is he does try to do these utility calculations all the time, and he is just a maddening person to be around. And he just creates a mess wherever he goes, right? He'll agree to come give a talk or meet someone, and in his head he's like, well, yeah, 60% chance I'll do that because we got to see the utility calculations, and I'm not going to make a decision until a time, right? And even Lewis, who's very sympathetic to this guy, says, well, part of the reason that he made such a mess was because he was always trying to do utility calculations, and he made some mistakes, right? And Mill will say, if we constantly try to do utility calculations, it's going to be exhausting. We're going to make mistakes. It's just not generally worth it, right? So what Mill says is in most cases, in most of our life, we are better following our ordinary moral rules of thumb, than we are trying to do explicit utility calculations. And I don't think this is completely implausible, right? I mean, think of it this way. I mean, I don't really invest. I don't have that much money. I have a retirement account and they do it for me. But I'm told by people who do invest, who know something about it, that a lot of times the easiest way to make money is to be pretty hands off, right? People who are constantly trying to beat the market, who are selling and buying and buying and selling, tend to lose more money than people who just buy stocks and just leave them, right? If you want to make money, people tell me, the advice is pretty simple. You can almost like put it on an index card, buy a mix of stocks, keep them, you know. And most people will say you will make more money in the long term by following fairly simple, boring rules of investing than you will trying to make the most money every week or even every month. In trying to maximize the amount of money you make, it's probably self-defeating because you're going to panic, you're going to make mistakes. Even if you don't, they will say you will waste a lot of effort and time and you probably won't do much better than if you just buy and sit on stuff, right? In the same way, Mill will say you will do better at creating happiness if you just kind of sit back. Maybe not sit back, but if you just follow these general moral rules, then instead of trying to do constant utility calculations. Or I'll give you guys a different example. I'm sorry to pick on my poor mom. She's a great woman. I love my mom. But I remember when we first started traveling, right? My parents grew up pretty poor. They didn't have money to travel when they were a kid. When I was younger, we didn't have really enough money to do it. And, family started doing better. We suddenly had more money to travel. But because my mom could travel, she was obsessed with getting the most out of it, right? She eventually got over this, but she was a very type A traveler, right? And the whole point of going on vacation is to relax, to have fun. And just the way my mom would travel didn't fit with this. Sometimes it was like, all right, we have to get the most out of our travel experience. We have to have as much fun as possible. So, right? I remember, like we'd be in some random city in the Midwest. We drove across country a couple times. We had relatives in California. We were in some random city in the Midwest, like, I don't know, Johnsonstown, Missouri. I don't know. It probably doesn't even exist. Hopefully it doesn't, because what I'm going to say is not true. Maybe my dad had just want to like, all right, we're just going to like, we're at a motel. Can we just sit by the pool and not do anything? I'm like, no, there is a yarn museum. It's 2 o'clock. We didn't drive all the way from Hillsville, Virginia to just sit by the pool or watch cable in our room. We're going to go to the yarn museum. We must have as much fun as possible. And right, when my mom finally, after we'd traveled a while, when she started to chill out, and it's just like, all right, whatever. We can, today's fun. We don't, yes, we are in something, something, Texas, but we don't have to go to the oil derrick museum. We can just watch HBO or go hang out by the pool, right? You will have more fun on vacation. You will relax more if you are not constantly obsessing about having fun, trying to have the most fun every second. The best way to have fun on vacation is not to think too much about having fun or to try to maximize the amount of fun you have, right? Mill will say it's the same way more generally for creating happiness. If you follow the moral rules, generally speaking, you will create more happiness. Now, you want to be clear, though, what Mill's saying. And sometimes people who don't want to listen to all these lectures I'll read will do a few Google searches, and they'll come back with this stupid idea of rule utilitarianism. If you talk about rule utilitarianism, I will know that you are not listening to me and you did not do the reading, and I will be annoyed. And rule utilitarianism, people will say, well, Mill thinks that we should follow the rules that generally create the most happiness, even when following the rules doesn't create the most happiness. And that's just wrong. The whole point for Mill is to create the most happiness. That's the whole point for any utilitarian. If it is, there are maybe some cases where it is abundantly clear to you where following the rules is not going to create the most happiness. And in those cases, you should not follow the rules any more than you should keep money in a stock when everything tells you the company's going to go out of business and you're going to lose every single dime. If that's happening, even though generally you should sit on the stock and not sell in a panic, if it's worth 25 cents on the dollar today and it'll be worth 0 cents on the dollar you paid for it tomorrow, you should try to get at least 25 cents back, right? Mill thinks that generally following the rules is the best idea, but when it is very clear to you there are going to be some circumstances where following the moral rules do not create the most happiness, Mill will say break them. Rules do not have any value in and of themselves, right? Or another way to think of this is, look, if you're in a strange city, Mill talks about rules as the Sailor's Almanac. We can think of it as a GPS, right? GPS is not always going to give you the best route, but if you were in a strange city, you are probably much better off just doing what the GPS tells you to do than you are getting out a paper map and trying to plan every route, right? You probably won't do as well. You might do a little better, but it's just not worth the effort, right? Having said that, if the GPS is directing you toward a road that dead ends and then drives out over a giant lake, you do not keep driving out into the lake and drive your car into the water. That's just crazy. You know the GPS is wrong, right? Generally follow the GPS. That's a good way to get how you want to go. But if it's driving you into a lake infested with alligators, you should use your own thought, right? In the same way, following moral rules will generally create the most happiness, but in cases where it clearly doesn't, in those cases, the rules have no value in and of themselves. So I think this is a more realistic picture than trying to constantly do utility calculations. Generally, follow the moral rules. Mill will say, so you have your utility calculations for when the rules are clearly wrong, or they might be wrong, or maybe even you might want to fix your moral rules. An example of this from Mill's own life: Victorian Britain was horribly sexist. Mill thought moral rules about how women should be treated weren't creating the most happiness. He wanted to reform them, right? He wrote this famous pamphlet on the subjugation of women, right? I think it was Mill wrote one. Maybe I'm mixing up his with somebody else's, but he wrote a famous pamphlet, right? Mill will also argue that utilitarianism is not as demanding as many make it out to be. He would think someone like Singer is wrong. And he would definitely think someone like McCaskill or Bostrom and Beckstead are, not applying utilitarianism as well as they should. And Mill has two reasons for this. Mill argues that the good we can do others is limited. I'll come back to this. We cannot help other people in the same way we can help people close to us. Mill will also say we do not know their situation. We might want to help people half a world away, but we don't know their situation, so we might not be able to. From this, Mill concludes we will generally, not always, but generally, most of us who are private citizens will create the most happiness by focusing on ourselves and those closest to us. People in public office, elected officials, maybe even business leaders, they might not be able to do this, but we, quote unquote, not quote unquote, Mill doesn't say this is my gloss, we ordinary civilians can follow the moral rules and create the most happiness. Now, I'm not sure about all of this, and I don't know that we get ourselves completely off the hook of utilitarianism being demanding with this, right? Mill wrote in 1863. And in 1863, the good you could do others was very limited. You know, you could not donate an organ. Just could not do it, right? It would kill you and the other person probably because, well, the idea that doctors should even wash their hands was really radical and out there, right? They didn't have antibiotics. What's more, they didn't even have blood typing, much less the sort of advanced tissue typing that you need to do organ transplants, right? Or rejection drugs. One of the reasons they work so well these days is the rejection drugs have just come leaps and bounds. If you even tried to give someone blood in 1863, very good chance you would kill them, right? If you have type B positive blood and you tried to give your blood to someone with O negative, you are almost certainly going to kill that person. But these days, there's a lot more we can do to help people. I can give blood. Organ donation is possible. And think about famines half a world away. In Mill's day, communication was really improving. You could hear about them before they were over, but the infrastructure just wasn't there. It was really hard to get aid there in time to do any good. Someone like Singer will say that's not the case anymore. We have planes, we have all this stuff. We have cell phones, we have satellites. If something bad is happening half a world away, you can hear about it today, and the plane can be on the way with relief supplies tomorrow. So I don't know, I think you're going to have a hard time avoiding conclusions like maybe we should donate organs to strangers. But I do think with stuff like McCaskill's like Saving the Future, or even Singer's We Have All These Duties to donate a lot to help other people, I think Mill might be right. Mill is not abandoning utilitarianism, but it is a more modest and realistic utilitarianism. And something I will tell you guys, and look, we should be cautious about this because we probably all want to believe we can't do that much to help because we don't want to give up our nice stuff. But there is a real argument about whether Singer-style charity, giving to charities that help people abroad, actually does any good. And now people like Beckstead and Bostrom, and especially Singer, will tell you, well, you can do all this research, and you can tell that some charities are honest, all the money goes there, they do what they say they do. But there is still a question whether it does any good. Effective altruists will say, well, think about malaria nets. They're so cheap, they can prevent malaria. Problem is, people often don't use them properly. It turns out it's really uncomfortable to sleep under a malaria net. It turns out malaria nets make great fish nets. So you try to help people this world away, it might not work the way you think it will, especially if you, Mr. Well-off American, well-off Englishman, do not know the situation in Bangladesh or wherever, right? Bangladesh is just where Singer had in mind. I think there's a lot to this. And there's an economist I like, Angus Deaton. He's written a few very good books, but one of them is just on how to help the global poor. And Deaton actually argues that Singer-style charity does more harm than good. Deaton's argument is, well, dysfunctional governments, they use international aid to prop themselves up, and they wouldn't be able to do this if they didn't get the aid, right? A lot of these governments are so dysfunctional and unresponsive, people just stop paying taxes. They could not finance themselves, they'd be kicked out of power. International aid allows them to hang on. I don't know that this is true. Deaton gives a lot of arguments for it, but it's not obviously false. It's much more of an open question than Singer lets on. It is much, much harder to help people than I think people like McCaskill realize, or Singer. But I think Mill would say this. Mill would say, look, we should have some modesty about it. We should try to help others, but we know more about our own situation. We know more about the situation in our own community. For Mill, at least for most of us, and I don't know that he's wrong, there is some reason to focus more locally because we know the situation better. It's not because for Mill we have any special connection or should to the people closest to us. It's just because we know what's going on better. We can more intelligently give and use aid. I don't know that that's completely wrong. There does seem to be something to it. Now, I think, even if Mill tries to get out, I do think a utilitarian, even if you think this is true, we're going to have to give away much, much more than most of us think. Even if I should keep the money local, it is very hard to argue that me spending $100 on a book buying spree on Amazon is going to create more happiness than me giving the money to somebody much poorer than me, whether that person's in my neighborhood or Bangladesh or wherever. Okay. That's all I want to say about this. In the next lecture, we're going to wrap this up for utilitarianism. I want to talk about this charge of bad faith. Mill has an answer to this. I think it does something to meet the charge, but there are still some issues here.